Welcome back to Whispers of Wisdom. Drop your city name in the comments if you liked the video. Let's start the story. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I wanted nothing more than to create a small space of peace in my backyard. I worked long hours, so planting a garden became my escape from stress. Over time, it grew into something bigger: rows of vegetables, blooming flowers, and even a small fountain that I built with my own hands. Neighbors often stopped to admire it, and many asked me for tips on starting gardens of their own. It felt like I was building not just plants, but community. But in every story, there's always someone who can't stand to see others happy. For me, that person was the HOA president. He was known for being strict, controlling, and always looking for ways to enforce rules nobody had ever heard of. At first, I didn't think much of his constant staring whenever he passed by my property. I thought maybe he was just curious. But soon enough, I realized he saw my garden not as a peaceful escape, but as a problem. One morning, I received a notice from the HOA claiming my garden was in violation of aesthetic guidelines. According to him, the fountain was unsightly, the vegetable rows were non-compliant, and even the flowers were considered a disruption. I was stunned. Nothing in the bylaws mentioned gardens being a violation. My neighbors loved it, and my property value had only gone up. Still, the president insisted I had 30 days to remove everything or face escalating fines. That was the first time I felt the weight of his power, and I realized this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The deadline was set, but I wasn't planning to back down. As the deadline loomed, I decided to research the HOA bylaws carefully. Page after page, I found nothing that supported the president's claims. There were guidelines about trash cans, fence heights, and exterior paint colors, but absolutely nothing about gardens. My space was clean, well-maintained, and even praised by local visitors. It was clear this wasn't about rules, it was about control. The HOA president had a reputation for targeting homeowners he personally disliked. He had fined one family for hanging a swing set, another for parking slightly outside the lines, and yet another for leaving their Christmas lights up a week too long. Most people caved because they didn't want the stress. I wasn't going to be another one of his victims. But when I pushed back, he escalated. Instead of fines, he called for an HOA board meeting to review my violations. Flyers were sent around the neighborhood, and whispers began to spread. Some neighbors were worried about siding with me, while others quietly told me they supported the garden but were afraid of retaliation. That fear was exactly how the president maintained his power. The night before the meeting, I noticed trucks parked near my home. Workers unloaded equipment, and one of them mentioned they'd been hired to clear out a non-compliant structure. My heart sank. The president wasn't just threatening anymore. He was preparing to bulldoze my garden. That was the moment I knew this fight was no longer just about plants or fountains. It was about standing up against someone who believed he was untouchable. The next day would decide whether my garden lived, or whether the president's power grew even stronger. The morning of the HOA meeting, I woke to the rumble of heavy machinery. My stomach twisted as I looked out the window. A bulldozer sat parked near my property line, its engine idling, while workers stood around with clipboards. The HOA president was there too, smug as ever, gesturing toward my garden as if he had already won. It didn't matter that no official ruling had been made. He had decided my garden was illegal, and in his mind, that was all the justification he needed to destroy it. I rushed outside, taking photos and videos of everything. My garden wasn't just at risk, it was hours away from being flattened under steel and dirt. Neighbors started gathering as well, drawn by the noise. Some were shocked, others whispered nervously, but I noticed many of them watching the president with disapproval. He had overstepped, and people were beginning to see it. The workers hesitated too, realizing this wasn't an ordinary demolition job. Without clear paperwork, they refused to touch the property until they had legal confirmation. That delay gave me the window I needed. I immediately contacted city officials and reported the unauthorized attempt to destroy private property. While I waited for a response, I shared the videos with neighbors and posted them online. The reaction was overwhelming. Comments poured in, calling out the HOA president's abuse of power and demanding accountability. By the time the board meeting began that evening, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. The president walked in confident, but the murmurs, stares, and folded arms around the room told a different story. For the first time, he didn't look untouchable. This wasn't going to be about one garden anymore. It was about exposing everything he'd been hiding. The board meeting started with the president trying to reassert control. He spoke as if the attempted demolition had never happened, painting me as a reckless homeowner who was defying community standards. But this time, the room didn't nod in agreement. My videos had already circulated, and whispers of his overreach filled every corner of the hall. Instead of defending myself, I presented evidence. I laid out the bylaws line by line, showing there was no rule against gardens. Then, I pulled up the footage of the bulldozer parked on my lawn, and the workers admitting they had no paperwork. Gasps spread through the room. The president shifted uncomfortably, but I wasn't finished. I had spent the past week quietly gathering information from neighbors who had been fined or threatened by him. Their stories revealed a pattern of intimidation and selective enforcement. One neighbor had records proving he'd been fined thousands of dollars for violations that didn't exist in the bylaws. Another had emails showing the president had threatened legal action over a harmless playset. The board members, who once stood firmly behind him, were now avoiding his gaze. They could see the truth. He wasn't protecting the neighborhood, he was abusing his authority. Still, he tried to dismiss everything as misunderstandings. But the evidence was stacked too high to ignore. As the meeting ended, no official decision was made, but the tide had shifted. The president was no longer untouchable, and cracks in his armor were beginning to show. I left that room knowing the battle wasn't over. If I wanted real change, I needed to uncover everything he'd been hiding, and that meant digging even deeper. After the board meeting, I doubled down on my investigation. I filed public record requests and combed through HOA financial reports that most residents never bothered to read. That's when I found it: irregularities in the budget. Thousands of dollars marked for community improvements had no receipts or documentation. The paper trail led straight back to the president. At the same time, more neighbors began speaking up. Stories poured out: fees that had been collected but never accounted for, projects that were promised but never completed, and rules that seemed to apply to everyone except the president himself. One neighbor revealed that his own landscaping company had been hired for an HOA job, but when he submitted the invoice, payment never arrived. Another discovered her mandatory late fee had been cashed directly into a personal account. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. The president wasn't just a bully. He was siphoning funds and using the HOA as his personal bank account. Armed with this evidence, I knew the next board meeting would be his downfall. When the day arrived, the room was packed. Neighbors who had once stayed silent filled every seat, ready to hear what I had uncovered. I presented the documents, the bank records, and the testimonies. Shock turned into anger as the truth sank in. People weren't just upset about my garden anymore. They realized the president had been abusing everyone in the community. The board had no choice but to launch an internal audit, and the president's face turned pale as the walls closed in. He had spent years building his image as the enforcer of rules, but now, The rules were finally being used against him. The stage was set for his complete downfall. The audit didn't take long. Within weeks, the board confirmed what everyone suspected. The HOA president had been misusing funds for years. Thousands of dollars were unaccounted for, funneled into personal expenses that had nothing to do with the neighborhood. Vacations, luxury items, and even private contractors had all been paid with HOA money. The community's reaction was swift and furious. Homeowners who had been too afraid to speak out now demanded his immediate removal. The board, under pressure, held a special vote. By an overwhelming majority, the president was stripped of his position and barred from ever holding another leadership role. The same neighbors he had intimidated now stood in line to sign the petition that sealed his fate. But his downfall didn't end there. Once the financial misconduct became public record, city officials got involved. He faced not only civil lawsuits from angry homeowners, but also legal consequences that would follow him for years. The man who had once strutted through the neighborhood with unchecked power was now forced to answer for every shady decision he'd made. As for my garden, it remained untouched. In fact, it became a symbol of resistance. Neighbors who had once hidden in silence began planting their own flowers and vegetables, transforming the community into something far more colorful and united than before. What started as one person's passion project turned into a movement that broke the cycle of fear. In the end, the president tried to bulldoze my garden, but instead, I bulldozed his career. And while he faded into the background, the garden flourished, stronger, brighter, and more alive than ever before.